The best thing I can say about Michael, well, not many good things. He's a wonderful person to work with, so that's really nice. He knows so much about Polish history. It's just amazing. And so I think we're going to get a sense as to how much he knows in his presentation today. And like I said, this is going to be part one, and we're going to have part two at another meeting. But also I neglected to introduce Tom Muszynski. He is a local filmmaker, and he is going to be making a film of Michael's work for posterity, and I think it will appear on YouTube as well. And through Małopolska, which is the business that Tom has, the filmmaking business that Tom has. But it's a very wonderful way of also getting out the story about Polish history and culture. Okay?
Thank you for those kind words, Donna. For the record, I don't think I know enough about Polish history, and that'll probably be revealed in the Q&A. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Donna, for your confidence. I hope the presentation does the subject justice. You know, I've been working on this for about a year, and the funny thing is, I didn't have an introduction to it until last night. And when I came up with the introduction, I realized that it was very reminiscent of one of my favorite poems. So I'm just going to read you the poem real quick. I think hearing the poem is going to help you appreciate the introduction that I have, which is just a simple 2 or 3 sentences. But the poem is called Stanza of Freedom. Men, whose boast is that ye come from fathers brave and free, if there breathe on earth a slave, are ye truly free and brave? If ye do not feel the chain when it works a brother's pain, if ye not base slaves indeed, slaves unworthy to be freed, women who shall one day bear sons that breathe New England air, if ye hear without a blush deeds that make the blood rush, like red lava through your veins, for your sisters that are in chains, answer, are you fit to be mothers of the free? Is true freedom but to break fetters for their own dear sake, and with leathern hearts forget that we owe mankind a debt? No. True freedom is to share all the chains our brothers wear. All chains, and with a heart and hand to be earnest to make others free. They are slaves who fear to speak for the fallen and the weak. They are slaves who will not choose hatred, scoffing, and abuse, rather in silence shrink from the truth that needs must think. They are slaves who dare not be in the right with 2 or 3. For your freedom and ours, the phrase encapsulates the spirit of solidarity and sacrifice that has characterized Fighting Poles' efforts to regain and maintain their own independence. It reflects the idea that the fight for freedom is not only for the benefit of Poland, but it is also for the liberation of all oppressed peoples, even if that effort comes at the detriment to those Poles. The Polish soldier fights for the freedom of all nations, but dies only for Poland. Stanislaw Maciek said those words. A Polish general and tank commander during the Second World War. His tank corps helped liberate France and was instrumental in helping seal the Falaise pocket and trapping 14 Wehrmacht and SS divisions. Raise your hand if you knew him. Raise your hand if you've heard of him. There's a few, that's good. Not many have. After the war, he couldn't return home. The Polish government there, the communist government, forbid it. So where would he go? To England. He fought for England, but they denied him a pension because he was not a soldier of England. So what did he do? He tended bar in Edinburgh for the last 20 years of his life, subsisting on donations from some of the Belgian cities that he helped liberate. His contributions were great, but his rewards were nearly non-existent. Such stories are a recurring theme. The contributions of Fighting Poles are often neglected in early education, undervalued in general history, overlooked in the media, and consequently, only remembered by those impacted directly. But their contributions were critical, far-reaching, and deserve remembrance, particularly in the annals of American military history. I came here where freedom is being defended, to serve it, and to live or die for it. Kazimierz Pulaski, a Polish nobleman, Brigadier General in the Continental Army, one of the United States' first cavalry commanders, Pulaski brought organization and proper training to the Continentals, securing the title Father of the American Cavalry. Recognizing the value of Pulaski's military experience, Benjamin Franklin helped recruit him to fight for the American cause. Such a cause he could certainly sympathize with, having just witnessed the first partition of Poland. Franklin wrote on Pulaski's behalf, describing him to George Washington, quote, as an officer famous throughout all of Europe for his bravery and conduct in defense of the liberties of his country. Upon being introduced to George Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette, he happened to catch George Washington when he was in the middle of writing a letter to Congress. That letter was describing the quality of the French officers that he had been given lately. Quote, men who in the first instance tell you that they only wish for nothing more than the honor of serving such a glorious cause as a volunteer. The next day, solicit rank, but without pay. The day following, want money advanced to them. And in the course of a week, want further promotion and are not satisfied with anything you give them. These are the officers that George Washington is getting. But while looking up, he sees Pulaski and he asks him, naturally, you would like a commission as an officer in our army? Have you decided what rank would suit you best? Pulaski would answer him bluntly, Excellency, I came to America to fight for a cause which I believe in. I do think my expertise merits a commission, but I have come to serve, and I will do so in whatever capacity I am assigned. Pulaski was ordered to Philadelphia with Washington's recommendation and instructed to wait for Congress's approval on what his commission will be. Well, his first order that he received from George Washington, he neglected. He came right back to George Washington saying, quote, what is to be gained by waiting in Philadelphia? When my commission is granted, I would prefer to be on the spot for immediate action. He didn't have to wait long. The Battle of Brandywine was about to begin. Called the American Revolution's Gettysburg, it was the largest land engagement of the Revolutionary War. As the fight progressed, General Howe caught Washington in a clever flanking maneuver. It appeared the Americans might be routed and Washington himself was in danger of being captured at this battle. But Pulaski, possessing no rank, asked to be given temporary command of Washington's personal guard cavalry. Washington assented and Pulaski successfully led a counterattack, not only helping delay the British advance, but potentially saving George Washington's life. After the Battle of Brandywine, Pulaski's wishes were granted and he was promoted to Brigadier General and given the title Chief Command of the American Light Dragoons. He would disagree constantly with the Continental Congress on how American cavalry should operate. Until now, cavalry was used primarily as reconnaissance units, dismounting in order to fight and then quickly remounting and retreating as the enemy advanced. This was not cavalry to a Pole. Poland had a century-long tradition of heavy cavalry, capable of breaking enemy formations by the sheer weight of their charge. The largest cavalry charge in history being made by Polish hussars in 1683 during the Siege of Vienna. Cavalry was meant more for reconnaissance, and Pulaski would show them. Arming his men with pistols, sabers, rifles, and lances, and capitalizing on his battlefield experience, Pulaski would create America's first effective cavalry arm. Soon to be followed by a few regiments of infantry, and Pulaski's Legion was born. Soon it became an effective and dangerous force on the battlefield. During the defense of Little Lake Harbor, New Jersey, in 1778, Pulaski's Legion would march double quick all the way from Trenton to the Mullica River to prevent a force of British soldiers from attacking and burning the gunpowder warehouses nearby. The surprise of just seeing organized American cavalry for the first time would send the British in full retreat. Then, on October 15th, the British would try again, this time attacking a nearby outpost, butchering 19 soldiers while they slept. But the outpost job was accomplished, and Pulaski's trap would be sprung. 3/4 of a mile away, Pulaski's Legion was ready, and soon 60 Polish-schooled American cavalry and a swarm of infantry would counterattack, causing 250 crack British light infantry to scatter back to their boats. As Thomas Paine would later write, quote, when the British look back on Egg Harbor, they see nothing but loss and disgrace. During the Second Battle of Savannah on October 9th, 1779, notified of the American plans by an informant, the British were prepared for an attack. As the tide quickly turned against the Americans, it was Pulaski who led an assault against the British position, hoping to drive a wedge between the British troops and gain the advantage. During that brave charge, he was killed, taking a grape shot directly to the heart. Charleston held a public funeral in honor of Pulaski's achievements, and the city of Savannah has since built a monument for him, and October 11th, one of the possible days of his death, has been designated General Pulaski Memorial Day in the United States. Several other American cities have followed suit over the years, erecting monuments and paying tributes. I personally think the best summation of his services was delivered by the White House proclamation of Pulaski Day in 2020. Quote, "The life of Polish-American hero Kazimierz Pulaski is a testament to our nation's ideals and a paragon to the cause of human freedom. General Pulaski's devotion to country and the shared values upon which our nation and Poland were both founded accentuates our common commitment to liberty. On General Pulaski Memorial Day, we honor and celebrate the courage and expertise in the American Revolution, which helped found the nation conceived in his ideals that he held most dearly. Perhaps his greatest honor 230 years after he died fighting in our American Revolution was when President Barack Obama signed a joint resolution of the House and Senate that Polish nobleman Kazimierz Pulaski be made an honorary citizen of the United States of America, one of only 8, joining the likes of Marquis Lafayette, Winston Churchill, and Mother Teresa. 2 months after Benjamin Franklin helped draft the Declaration of Independence, Thaddeus Kosciuszko would walk into his Philadelphia shop and introduce himself, offering to enlist as an officer in the new American Army. Franklin, curious, would quiz Kosciuszko about his education, a military academy in Warsaw, studies in Paris, civil engineering, but Franklin would ask for his letters of recommendation. Kosciuszko could produce none, but he offered to take a placement exam if that would help in engineering and military architecture to prove his resume. Franklin, bemused, would answer, "And who would proctor such an exam? There's no one in our new nation and scarcely the continent familiar with such a subject." That is how needed Kosciuszko's skills were. Upon his introduction to Congress, John Hancock would appoint him the colonel in the Continental Army in October, and Franklin hired him to design and build forts on the Delaware River to help defend Philadelphia from the British Army. One such fort would be Fort Mercer here in New Jersey, which certainly did its job during the Battle of Red Bank, helping 400 Continentals repel an attack of over 1,200 Hessians. While building those forts near Philadelphia, Kosciuszko would befriend General Horatio Gates, commander of the Continental Army's Northern Division, and in May 1777, Gates would bring Kosciuszko to New York to help evaluate and prepare the defenses of Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga was built by the French in 1755 and is very strategically placed at the end of Lake Champlain. When the British would attempt to capture this fort many years before, during the French and Indian War, they would fail and suffer more casualties than any other engagement on this continent until the American Revolution. When Kosciuszko arrives at the fort, he finds the defenses were adequate, but he recommends all efforts be made to fortify Sugarloaf Hill, a heavily wooded mountain with a vantage point above the fort. No one, however, including the fort's commander, Arthur Sinclair, believed it possible for an army to haul heavy artillery up such a rocky height. Shortly after Kosciuszko's arrival, British General John Burgoyne would begin his advance from St. John's, Canada, with 7,100 regulars and 2,500 Tory allies. Once they reached Fort Ticonderoga, Major General William Phillips, Burgoyne's head of artillery, would begin to scout Sugarloaf Hill with much difficulty. But upon seeing a goat on its summit, he would utter the now famous phrase repeated by all British artillerymen: "Where a goat can go, a man can go, and where a man can go, he can haul up a gun." Thus, on the 4th of July, the 1-year anniversary of signing of our Declaration of Independence, British guns would signal that the fight was over before it would begin, and the Continentals would need to retreat, despite Kosciuszko's pleadings. But during that retreat, Kosciuszko would draw on all his military engineering skills to hamper Johnny Burgoyne's southward advance, turning the 23-mile winding route into a living hell of destroyed bridges, dammed streams, felled trees, and booby traps. From Montreal to Ticonderoga, Burgoyne's army had traveled an average of 18 miles a day. From Ticonderoga to Saratoga, 2 miles a day. Kosciuszko, though, was saving his greatest contribution for last. Scouting ahead of the Continental Army on his own, he would discover an elevated pasture narrowly hugging the road to Albany. There, Kosciuszko would gallop on his horse in a circle 3 times before proclaiming, "This is the spot." Kosciuszko had found Bemis Heights, an impassable feature along the British Army's future advance. Quickly, Kosciuszko would direct such an intricate series of redoubts and entrenchments on that spot that if it were ever assaulted, it would funnel the British Army into an obvious killing field. However, it was never assaulted. So why is that position important? Well, because now General Gates could anticipate the direction of Burgoyne's attack, put his least reliable troops, the militia, in that fort, where they'll never be attacked, and put his best troops on his left flank where they're most likely to be attacked. Daniel Morgan's riflemen, where they can inflict the most amount of damage. For the next month, Saratoga would sway back and forth until finally the British provision-shortened army would be forced to surrender on October 7, 1777. I don't have it written down here, but I think it also bears mentioning that around that time, the British were also attempting to assault Fort Mercer in Philadelphia. And that's when General Howe was realizing, as commonly said, that he had not taken Philadelphia. Philadelphia had taken him. He couldn't get out. Washington was above him, and Kosciuszko's forts were on the Delaware River. Kosciuszko is affecting both of these battles at this point in military history. With engineering talents, with shovel, saw, and axe, he had helped enable the inexperienced American troops to defeat some of Europe's finest professional soldiers. For the first time in history, an entire British army on the field would have been forced to surrender in its entirety. Congress would authorize a plaque near Kosciuszko's tomb in Krakow with the inscription, "A Grateful America Remembers Thaddeus Kosciuszko, fighter for your freedom and ours." In March 1778, after the Battle of Saratoga, going too far. After the Battle of Saratoga, Kosciuszko was appointed the engineer of West Point, where he develops a system of mutually supported integrated fortifications so ahead of its time, former West Point Superintendent Richard Palmer would call it a 19th century fortified complex in an 18th century war. And when Kosciuszko finished the construction in 1780, George Washington would refer to West Point as the key to the continent. And in August 1780, West Point's new commander, Benedict Arnold, would realize how valuable of a key that could be. It would take 6 full pages of paper written in Benedict Arnold's own hand to detail those fortifications that Kosciuszko had helped engineer. And that is what John Andre was captured with when he was trying to smuggle it. With Arnold's, and thus foiling Arnold's conspiracy to surrender West Point. Future West Pointers certainly thought highly of Kosciuszko as well, because in 1825, the cadets were all given an opportunity to create a monument to someone from the American Revolution who they wanted to memorialize. They could have chosen anyone, any of our founding fathers. They chose Kosciuszko. They chose him for what he represented to them, a patriot, someone who loved and fought for liberty away from his native land, a professional soldier who's dedicated to the American cause. And there today, Kosciuszko's monument stands forever gazing towards Poland, even though it's being repaired right now. In 1780, George Washington offered Kosciuszko a transfer to the Southern Army. Kosciuszko proceeded to North Carolina with Major General Nathaniel Greene, and many of his contributions there were instrumental in helping prevent that army's destruction. This was especially true during the famous Race to the Dan, where British General Cornwallis would shed all of his army's baggage and chase Greene across 200 miles of rough backcountry in January and February 1781. Thanks largely to a combination of Greene's tactics and Kosciuszko's river scouting and boat building, the Continentals would safely cross each river, including the Yak Dam and the Dan. On the way to that, Kosciuszko would also help pick out what would futurely be the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, or the field that it would be fought on. Today, statues of Kosciuszko grace 8 major American cities. He was also one of the first members of the Society of the Cincinnati, a veterans organization for American officers who served in the Continental Army during the Revolution. So certainly his fellow officers held him in high esteem, and also when Washington handpicked his officers who would join him for his farewell dinner, Kosciuszko was among them. Hearing the general's parting remarks, quote, "I most devoutly wish that your later days be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." I'll go a little quick here. He returns to Poland. He attempts the Kosciuszko uprising. It fails. And just a funny story for anyone that might not know it is when he's captured by Catherine the Great, he is offered a pardon. He does not take it. Catherine the Great dies, and Tsar, I believe it is Paul, takes over and offers Kosciuszko a one-time offer, 12,000 rubles, and he will free every single Polish hostage that is in the Gulag. Under those conditions, Kosciuszko accepts, and Paul, as a gesture of kindness, gives him the fur coat off of his own back to Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko comes to America, and Thomas Jefferson, his good friend, remarks that he has a fondness for the coat. Kosciuszko says, "You can have it. It means nothing. It just reminds me of Russian oppression." So Thomas Jefferson decides to pose for it in his presidential portrait. Also, if you've been to the Jefferson Memorial, that's him wearing the coat. In the US Civil War, Poles were contributing as well. It is estimated 5,000 Polish Americans fought for the Union. Two notable Polish immigrants who I'll quickly go over. Joseph Karsh, sentenced to death for his involvement in the unsuccessful 1848 revolution in Poland. He was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the 1st New Jersey Volunteer Regiment, and he would be wounded at 2nd Bull Run. Władimir Krzyżanowski was an exiled Polish noble who would rise to the rank of brigadier general while holding a command at the Battle of Gettysburg. His troops were assaulted by the famed Louisiana Tigers atop East Cemetery Hill, and the general would exclaim the fate of the battle might mean the repulse of that attack. Well, with a determined bayonet charge, Krzyżanowski held the day and kept the hill. Throughout his life, Krzyżanowski fought for the rights of personal freedom, from an ill-fated revolution in Poland to serving the Union Army to various government positions. His belief and desire to protect it never faltered. He arrived in the United States alone and poor, but learned what one can achieve anything in America and you should have the right to do so. He called the U.S. Constitution the greatest thing about his new homeland, and he fought to uphold it. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Before the First World War, Polish pianist Ignacy Paderewski traveled to Chicago to champion the cause of Polish independence. His travels to Polish American communities and finally to the White House were instrumental in affecting the opinion of Woodrow Wilson, who in January 1917, during his Peace Without Victory summit, would assert that there must be a united and independent Poland. Polish Americans vigorously supported the war effort during the First World War, with large numbers volunteering. A common theme was to both support America and afterwards fight for a restored and independent Poland. Literary Digest estimated that the U.S. Army had 220,000 Polish Americans in its ranks, and of the first 100,000 volunteers to enlist in the U.S. Army upon the declaration of war with Germany, over 40% were Polish Americans. Organizations such as the Polish Falcons of Pittsburgh, PA, would propose the formation of a Kosciuszko army, not technically affiliated with the U.S. Army, to fight under the Stars and Stripes, but continue on afterwards to Poland to fight for its independence. They would adopt the following resolution. Quote, "We have reached a time when momentary deeds affect the course of nations and monarchies. The United States is at war with Imperial Germany, the foe of the Polish race for the last 1,000 years. Loyal Polish Americans, it is your time to fight, your urgent duty to stand in the ranks of the defenders of liberty. We appeal to you, our countrymen, scattered throughout the lands of your adopted nation. Hasten to the ranks of the Kosciuszko army, and may our triumphs lead us to the realization of a free, independent, and undivided Poland." In 1917, the U.S. War Department announced that Poles in America who were not naturalized citizens could enlist in a new military contingent known as the Blue Army, a volunteer force, 35,000 initially, swelling to over 68,000 by war's end. And at the conclusion of the war to end all wars, these soldiers were on their way to a newly independent Poland to fight for its borders with the Soviet Union. And thus, after 123 years, Poland is reborn. In the late 1930s, with its thin industrial base and long borders, next to two powerful dictatorships, Poland would become isolated. Polish foreign policy was one of equal distances, seeking friendly relationships with the Soviet Union and Germany, but alliances with neither. But in 1939, a decision would need to be made. Hitler would demand Poland cede territory to Germany and join the anti-Comintern Pact against Russia. Stalin offered an alliance as long as the Red Army could be stationed inside Poland's borders. Of course, they would never leave. Marshal Edward Rydz-Smygli would sum up Poland's position, quote, "With the Germans, we run the risk of losing our liberty. With the Russians, we would lose our souls." With war seeming imminent in 1939, Joseph Beck, Poland's Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs, announced to the world the choice that Poland had made. Quote, "Peace is a precious and desirable thing. Our generation, bloodied in wars, certainly deserves peace, but peace, like almost all things in this world, has its price, a high but a measurable one. We in Poland do not know the concept of peace at any price. There is only one thing in the lives of men, nations, and countries that is without price. That thing is honor." Poland's decision to stand alone would lead to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Hitler and Stalin with secret plans for the division of Poland once it is conquered. But an unintended result of this pact was the work of Marian Rejewski, a Polish mathematician and cryptologist. The flurry of diplomatic cables during that time of that pact, which was sent in late August, was sent using the Enigma machine. which Poles had begun to decrypt in 1932. Without the breakthroughs that he and many other Poles provided to the French and British in 1939, the UK and the United States may have never been fully able to exploit Enigma. Dwight Eisenhower would call breaking the Enigma code decisive for Allied victory, and many historians believe shortened the war by 2 full years. The Second World War would grip Poland as it did no other nation in Europe. Invaded by both Germany and the Soviet Union, it remained under occupation by a foreign army from the first day of the war until the last. 6 million Poles would die. A staggering 19% of Poland's pre-war population, a higher percentage than any other country that fought in the Second World War. After the invasion, the Polish state may have fallen, but the Polish people were far from defeated. Fired by vengeance and the hope for liberation, Poles would field 4 separate armies after they lost their country. Whether in the skies of Britain, the hills and valleys of Italy, the deserts of Africa, or the mud and blood of the Eastern Front, Poles were fighting. They were fighting for their freedom and for yours. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Downing would admit later he had been a little doubtful first about the Polish airmen that were beginning to come to England for service during the Battle of Britain. But in 1940 and 1941, the Polish pilots frankly stole the show. At the height of the Battle of Britain, June 1940, Polish pilots would count for 12% of all fighter aircraft over England. And despite joining the fray, 2 months before the battle, the 303rd Kosciuszko was the highest scoring squadron in the RAF. At the time it was withdrawn from battle for rest, on October 11, 1940, the squadron would claim 126 kills in 6 weeks. Just a few pilots of note: Witold Urbanowski, squadron leader of the 303rd, he personally shot down 4 planes in 2 days, ended the Battle of Britain with 15 victories, becoming one of only 8 RAF triple aces. When asked why Polish airmen fight so fiercely, he would comment, "Because we do not beg for freedom, we fight for it." Stanislaw Skalski, top Polish ace of the war, chronologically the first Allied ace of the war, credited with 22 victories. He would later rise to the rank of general in post-war Poland. One of his fellow pilots would describe him as, quote, "an eagle in the air." He was a great commander and a brilliant leader. We would follow him to hell if necessary. And of course, on the bottom, Gabi Gabritsky, son of a Polish immigrant born in Oil City, Pennsylvania. He was America's highest scoring ace over Europe with 28 victories, and the only 2-war ace in American history after serving in the Korean War. At war's end, Sir Hugh Downing would later write, "Had it not been for the magnificent work of the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same." On the high seas, there was the ORP Prion, or Lightning in Polish, an N-class destroyer transferred to the Free Polish Navy in 1940. This ship is small, lightly armored, focusing on speed and torpedoes. Captained by Eugeniusz Pulaski, he was a fierce patriot, a highly experienced and aggressive officer who commanded destroyers for the Tsar in the First World War. He commands an all-veteran Polish crew. They are well-trained and hungry for revenge. In May of 1941, they're going to get their opportunity because Admiral Sir Philip Van's destroyer flotilla would be in the North Sea when they would receive urgent orders. HMS Hood is gone. Bismarck is escaping. Help hunt her before she reaches France. Bismarck is Germany's largest and newest battleship. She had just broken out into the North Atlantic within 10 minutes of fighting, sunk the pride of the British Navy, battlecruiser HMS Hood. With time against him, Vian takes a gamble. He flings all his destroyers to Bismarck's last known position. It increases his chance of finding it, but that means one destroyer may have to engage alone until the rest can arrive. And on the night of the 26th, Prion sights an unknown big ship. She attempts to establish its identity, and the mystery ship answers with gunfire. It's the Bismarck. Pulaski signals Admiral Vian, and Vian orders the rest of the flotilla to converge, but they are all hours away. Prion now faces a choice. One solid hit from Bismarck's guns would obliterate the small and lightly armored ship. But fleeing runs the risk of losing sight of the Bismarck before the other destroyers arrive. Pulaski orders a single message sent to the German battleship, uncoded: "I am a Pole," and charges Bismarck alone. For over an hour, Prion snapped at Bismarck's heels. One Polish single destroyer against the pride of the German Navy. Prion would launch everything she had. Torpedoes, 4.7-inch shells, her anti-aircraft guns. There's even tales that numerous crew members would be out on deck screaming and firing their rifles towards the battleship. One full salvo of Bismarck's 15-inch guns missed Prion by less than 20 yards. Though no hits were made on either ship, the engagement takes time off Bismarck's clock that could have been used to rest or repair the Bismarck's crew. Prion burns so much fuel and torpedoes that Admiral Vian orders her to withdraw for the final engagement. Sorry, radio problems, the captain answers, and continues to fight. In the end, the big guns, the swordfish torpedo planes, would sink the Bismarck, but she was located and held in place by one small, fearless Polish destroyer. On land, Polish manpower contributions were the 4th highest among all Allied nations. Free Polish soldiers in the West fought in France and Belgium in 1940, Norway in 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk, all of North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and Market Garden. In the East, the Polish army of the USSR would fight every major action there following the Battle of Kursk. And although I wish I had time to discuss the Polish aviators above the beaches of Normandy, the 1st Polish Armored Division's contributions in France, or the independent Polish Parachute Brigade, I cannot discuss fighting Poles without detailing Monte Cassino and the Polish Second Corps. Monte Cassino was the linchpin of the German line in Italy. 7 acres of Traventino stone with a facade twice as long as Buckingham Palace. It sits 1,700 feet above the Liri Valley, which is the gateway to Rome. Hitler ordered, quote, "the best reserves must stand on that isolated mountaintop and under no circumstance must it be lost." In January-February 1944, US and French soldiers would assault Monte Cassino, taking 10,000 and 8,000 casualties respectively. One soldier would later say, quote, "Personally, I'm glad we didn't take our objectives, else they think us immortal and make us go on forever despite fatigue, slaughter, and annihilation." In mid-February, Lieutenant Bernard Freyberg and his British, Indian, and New Zealand troops were now given the task. But after researching several studies into the monastery, which included its looped, unscalable outer walls, 10 feet thick and no more less than 15 feet high, he would send the memo back to Mark Clark, quote, "No practical means available within the capacity of field engineers can possibly cope with this place." He therefore made up his mind before an assault could be launched, the abbey itself would have to be obliterated. Thus, on February 15th, 250 Allied bombers would drop 600 tons of high explosives and incendiaries on Monte Cassino. Hundreds of artillery pieces would join the bombardment, and by 2 p.m., the abbey would be a smoking ruin. However, the walls, though battered, could never be breached to ground level. The Germans promptly buried deep into that rubble, creating machine gun nests in the masonry and artillery observation posts in the broken ramparts. That night, the ground attack would begin, and the now hidden German mortars and machine guns would kill or wound half the attacking force before they could even cover 50 yards. Obliterating Monte Cassino brought no military advantage of any kind. General Harold Alexander was quoted, quote, "Unfortunately, we are dealing with the best soldiers in the world. The tenacity of these German paratroopers is remarkable, considering that they were just subjected to the whole Mediterranean Air Force, plus the better part of 800 guns under the greatest concentration of firepower which has ever been put down. I doubt if there are any troops in the world who could have stood up to that and gone on fighting as ferociously as they have." For the 3rd attack, the monastery was preceded by 1,000 tons of artillery fire. One New Zealand soldier would note that entering Cassino now is like entering the end of the world. Everything looked like it was raked over by some giant comb and then pounded with a massive hammer. Again, the German defenses would rally quickly. Allied armor would be held up in bomb craters, torrents of rain and mud would flood the infantry, and on March 23rd, the 3rd attack was deemed a failure and called off. For the 4th and final battle of Monte Cassino, it is now the Polish Second Corps' turn to enter the fight. But before I discuss the Polish Second Corps' exploits in Italy, it is important to understand the epic journey that these men had taken just to reach that Italian mountain. Following the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland in 1939, some 1.7 million Polish soldiers and citizens found themselves arrested and transported to Soviet labor camps and prisons. Only after 2 years, when Germany invades Russia and it's to Stalin's benefit, does he agree to finally begin releasing prisoners for this anti-fascist struggle. Major General Władysław Anders is given command of the proposed army. Released after 18 months of captivity, he would later write, quote, "God only knows how many were murdered, how many died under the terrible conditions of those prisons and camps. He knew he needed to organize and evacuate as many Poles out of Russia as he possibly could." but the communist government refused to allow the Polish soldiers to head to Britain to join the units forming there. Stalin would only open the Gulag gates to provide soldiers for his own army. Few Poles would be willing to join the Soviet ranks, and thus Polish soldiers and their families hung in limbo, starving on the steppes of Russia. A small miracle was the over 800 charitable American services which would arrive to help, offering shelter, providing food, welfare aid, building 58 elderly care homes, and 105 schools. It took over a year for Stalin to allow the Polish soldiers and their families to leave Russia and cross through Iran. But that several thousand-mile journey was a tragedy in itself. With little help and few logistics, their struggle was horrific. Only one of the soldiers' stories here I'm going to recount. Quote, "The trains were completely unreliable. I cannot begin to describe the absolute mess, confusion, and uncertainty that existed. Destinations for rail cars written in chalk, only to be washed away by rain hours later. At a place called Kubambiev, my father and I left to try to find some food for our family. And when we returned, the train had departed with my mother and younger sister. We tried to catch up, but this was an impossible task. After a week, my father would become ill and eventually die. I would bury him. I have no idea where. I was on my own. What I did to survive, I will never talk about. The hunger was unbearable, and I would lie awake at night thinking what I would give for a single piece of bread." From Iran, soldiers would move across Iraq and be equipped and further trained to join the Polish Independent Carpathian Brigade, who has been fighting Rommel in North Africa. At the Quebec Conference, Churchill would write the Sir Allen book, quote, "The time has come to bring the Polish troops into the Mediterranean theater. The men wish to fight, let's use them immediately." The Second Corps would land at Toronto, Italy in December 1943, and it would not take them long to establish a reputation for toughness, spirit, and gallantry. As put by the officer of an Irish guard, quote, "Their motives were as clear as they were simple. They only wished to kill Germans. They did not bother at all about the usual refinements about taking over posts. They simply walked in with their weapons and were asked, 'Where are the Germans?' And once being directed, that was that. They would expose themselves with the most reckless abandon. They seemed to know no fear." In May, the commander of the 8th Army, General Oliver Lessey, will call Anders into his headquarters in order to discuss the planned 4th assault for Monte Cassino. Lessey would offer this chance to capture the abbey itself to the Polish Second Corps. Anders would accept after reasoning, quote, "Despite the difficulty, I knew that battle would have international scrutiny. It would show the world. Poles were here to fight." The plan for the Second Corps was a direct frontal assault against the strong German positions. For the Polish soldiers who had been abducted, imprisoned, wandered through Russia, the Middle East, and now Italy for 5 years since their country's defeat. This battle would be a chance to regain their honor. Anders ordered the day before the assault read, quote, "Soldiers, the task assigned to us will cover with glory the name of the Polish soldier all over the world. The moment for battle has arrived. At this moment, the thoughts and hearts of our whole nation will be with us. We have long awaited the moment for revenge and retribution over our hereditary enemy. Keep deep in your heart God, honor, and our land, Poland. Go and take revenge." For the first night's assault, Polish troops would blacken their faces and don camouflage wraps. Within the first 500 yards, they were burying beneath the bodies of dead comrades, seeking cover from murderous machine gun and mortar fire. By mischance, the Germans had chosen that night to relieve the defenders behind Monte Cassino with fresh troops. The hillside garrison was now double its normal strength. At points in the battle, all is confusion. Hand grenades thrown mere feet away. German positions mixed with Poles, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting would commence. The Polish sappers later barked at clearing the dangerous minefields. Then a Carpathian commander would bark over the radio, "If they do not obey orders, shoot them." They would obey, and 20 Polish engineers would be sent to clear the mines. 18 would be killed. The number of casualties would shock the Poles. By nightfall of the first day, the line of jeeps carrying the wounded would seem endless, a Polish corporal would report. 5 days later, on the 17th of May, the Polish would renew their assault. Initial progress would be slow. One observer wrote, quote, "When the second attack began, the Polish soldiers were drained physically and psychologically. The issue would hung on a knife's edge. Fighting would rage all night." Here is Lance Corporal Dombrowski's description of that renewed assault. Quote, "We lie there waiting, and then at last the order comes to move. Always the same cry. Ammo, ammo, more ammo. Apart from double our normal ammunition, we each carry between 30 and 40 pounds of grenades. The going is difficult in the heat. The weakest soldiers struggle to keep pace. We are in no particular formation, no sections, no platoons. Later, we worry about reorganizing when we engage the enemy. The Polish Second Corps would break apart the defenses of the Abbey on that day, but their situation was precarious. Casualties had been enormous, platoons and battalions were hopelessly mixed up, and ammunition was nearing empty. It was impossible to say what the dawn would bring. But the Abbey's guns, mortars, and artillery, now focused on those Polish Second Corps, the Free French were able to make progress further to the south. With risk of being surrounded, Albert Kesselring would order the German troops to be withdrawn. The following morning, any remaining Germans that could still walk would be evacuated. One of the first Polish soldiers to step foot in the Abbey would later write, quote, "I shall never forget the pure joy of that moment. We could hardly believe our long task was done. Our division had not met the Germans on the battlefield since Tobruk, Africa, and had waited for this moment for 2 years. At 9:50 a.m., the Poles would raise their national flag in triumph over the ruins. A bugler would then step forward and play the medieval Polish signal, the Krakow Pajal. When the notes were heard over the radio, the 4th Carpathian Battalion's HQ officers and enlisted men alike unashamedly wept. The Poles had faced the most formidable German opposition, the German 1st and 3rd Parachute Regiments. One German paratrooper, Joseph Klein, would pay tribute to them. Quote, "They are brave soldiers, yes, but it was more like an inner drive that went almost beyond the level, a level of fanaticism. They looked death in the face and marched nonetheless. We often couldn't believe it." The Polish Second Corps would receive an honorary decoration after the Battle of Cassino. 8th Army Order Number 65 granted the right of all individuals who took part in Cassino to permanently wear the 8th Army shield on their right shoulder, even in the future if they were no longer part of the 8th. Supreme Allied Commander of the Mediterranean, Sir Hugh Alexander, would send a message personally to the Poles. Quote, "Soldiers of the Second Corps, if I had been given to me to choose the soldiers I would like to command in the field, I would choose the Second Corps. I pay tribute to you." Polish casualties were 72 officers and 788 other ranks killed, 204 officers and 2,618 other ranks wounded. Several war cemeteries will be built around the battlefield, but the closest to symbolize its importance is the Polish War Cemetery at Monte Cassino. An inscription adjacent to it fittingly reads, for our freedom and yours, we soldiers of Poland gave our soul to God, our life to the soil of Italy, our hearts to Poland." In occupied Poland, contributions to the Allied cause were also being made. 48% of all reports received by the British Secret Service in continental Europe were coming from Poland. Polish agents would provide reports of German war production, morale, and troop movements. Oxford professor Richard J. Crampton would estimate 1/8 of all German transports on the Eastern Front were substantially delayed or destroyed by Polish saboteurs. Confirmed sabotage numbers from 41 to 44 would include damage to 38 rail bridges, 800 locomotives, 19,000 railway wagons, and the destruction of 4,600 tons of fuel, the built-in flaws to 203 cannons, 4,700 aircraft parts, and 92,000 artillery projectiles, and the assassination of 5,733 German officers. Polish underground forces would also help British airmen smuggle a fully operational V-2 rocket out of Poland for analysis. The Polish government in exile would publish the brochure The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-occupied Poland in 1943, which is the first official account given to the Western general public about the Holocaust in German-occupied Poland. The report was the first to use the term extermination camp, the first to detail Gross Action Warsaw, which was the Nazi code name for the deportation and murder of all Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto during 1942. It was the first report to detail the extermination camps of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. It also estimated 1/3 of the 3 million Poles in Germany, of the 3 million Polish Jews had already been murdered, which was actually an understatement. Poland was also the only occupied nation where helping a Jew was punishable by death for not only yourself, but your entire family. Righteous among the nations is an honorific title used by the state of Israel to describe non-Jews who would risk their lives during the Holocaust to save Jews from extermination camps. There are 7,177 Polish men and women recognized as righteous among nations, over a quarter of the full total. Zagoda, a Polish government-established delegation specifically created to try to help save the Jews. Poland was the only country in German-occupied Europe where such a government-established and supported organization had existed. At a 1979 international conference dedicated to Holocaust rescuers, J. Friedman said in a reference to Poland, quote, "If we knew the names of all the noble people who risked their lives to save the Jews, then the area around Yad Vashem would be full of trees and would turn into a forest." Many hold that the number of Poles who helped Jews is greatly underestimated. There may have been as many as 1.2 million Polish rescuers. In August 1st, 1944, reports would begin trickling into German high command of skirmishes with Polish bandits in and around the capital of Warsaw. Hitler would be more concerned about the rapid advance of the Red Army and gave it little thought. But in that evening, it would become clear. These were not isolated incidents. This was a large-scale, simultaneous, and coordinated revolt. The Warsaw Uprising had begun, an attempt by the Polish Home Army to liberate Warsaw before the arrival of the Soviet Union. Initial successes were made, but with almost a complete lack of outside support, the situation would grow dim. The Polish government in exile carried out frantic diplomatic efforts to gain support from the Western Allies prior to the start of the battle, but the Allies would not act without Soviet approval. Finally, on the 13th of September, Joseph Stalin initiated limited humanitarian and military air jobs to Warsaw, but it was too little and too late to help the Poles. Hitler and Himmler, furious at the insurrection, would draft the Order of Warsaw, which not many people know about. To me, it stands as one of the most chilling documents of the entire Second World War. It reads, Order 1, captured insurgents are to be killed, regardless as to whether they are fighting or not. 2, parts of the population not fighting, even women and children, should likewise be killed if at all hindering Order number 3. Order number 3, all buildings, i.e. houses, offices, hospitals, museums, synagogues, archives, the streets themselves are to be destroyed and burned. Everything is to be leveled to the ground. For more than 60 days, the Polish fighters would hold off the SS's most vicious forces, but during those 60 days, Warsaw's population would be besieged, burned, pulverized, and then massacred. By October 2nd, a population that had numbered 1.3 million was gone. 400,000 Jews dead. 700,000 residents expelled from the city, 100,000 of them to become forced laborers. 150,000 to 200,000 civilians buried underneath rubble and turned to ash. 18,000 Polish resistance fighters dead. In January 1945, 90% of all buildings in Warsaw would be completely destroyed. And post-war, tens of thousands of former resistance members would be arrested, deported, and killed by the Soviets. It gets worse. Polish writer Alexander Fredo once wrote, "Woe to the man who depends on the fate of another. Woe to all the more to the nation which depends on the interests of another nation. For nations have no conscience." As the Polish Second Corps was refitting and preparing for their next Italian offensive, they faced their most daunting crisis yet: morale. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Big Three would meet to discuss the fate of post-war Europe. Each leader would come with their own set of priorities. FDR would want the Soviet Union's commitment to join the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. Stalin agreed. Churchill would want Greece to remain in the Western Allies' sphere of influence. Stalin agreed. But those agreements, among others, came at a price. The Western Allies agreed to Stalin's demands regarding Poland. They agreed to award all of Eastern Poland's territory to the Soviet Union, Belarus, and Ukraine in exchange for some German territory to the west. The Allies also recognized the provisional government of Poland, established by the Soviet Union, so long as free and fair, independent elections were held, which they were not. Virtually all of the men of the Second Corps were from Eastern Poland. Tadeusz Żukowski of the 3rd Division would record his reaction, quote, "From that moment on, we knew there was no way back for us, no hope. We knew that we were now fighting solely for honor and dignity, and nothing else. The despair amongst our ranks was overwhelming. We lost faith in the Allies. Still we fought on, wherever they sent us, whenever they sent us. Only this time, we did not feel like Polish soldiers fighting for a good cause. We felt like mercenaries." To the Poles, Stalin was the man who stole their homes, deported them deep into the Soviet Union, and murdered the Polish officer corps and intelligentsia in the forests of Katyn. For the First World War had come close to being a good war for Poland. The defeat and collapse of the 3 countries which had partitioned their territory led to restoration of Poland's independence. The Second World War, in contrast, was nothing short of a catastrophe. At its end, Poland became the only Allied country to be abandoned behind the Allied curtain. And one final last humiliation. On the 26th of April 1945, the founding conference of the United Nations was set to begin in San Francisco. However, before the conference could begin, they needed to settle the most sensitive issue at hand: Poland. What would be Poland's participation and representation? The United Kingdom, the United States, demanded the attendance of at least one representative from the Polish government in exile in London. The Soviet Union protested and stipulated only a delegate from the People's Republic of Poland would be accepted. Political summits produced no compromise, and therefore Poland was never officially represented at the United Nations inaugural conference. Poland, the first nation attacked, among the hardest suffering as a result of the Second World War, went unrepresented. That fact of betrayal was lost on some, but not on the composer whom the UN requested open the ceremony, pianist Arthur Rubinstein, who himself is of Polish descent. During the inauguration ceremony of the San Francisco Opera House, over 80 representatives of all UN member nations were assembled when Rubinstein would take center stage. As described by his wife, quote, "Once he finished the opening concert with the Star-Spangled Banner, you could see something in him snap. Suddenly he would rise from his seat, and while looking around the great hall, point out the multitude of national flags hung in places of remembrance and honor, and loudly exclaim, 'Since among the flags I do not see that of my native Poland, I would like to begin this concert with the Polish national anthem. Please stand.'" Those in attendance said the manner he played, "Poland is not yet lost," was loud, slow, and deliberate. The soul of Poland, in the end, as Winston Churchill stated on October 1st, 1939, the day Poland truly fell, quote, "The soul of Poland is indestructible, and she will rise again, like a rock, which for a spell may be submerged by a tidal wave, but in the end will always remain a rock." Thank you. How'd that go? I disassociated through most of that. I feel like I just woke up.
Questions for
We
Michael.
were.
Yeah, I'll take any softball questions.
I'm exhausted.
Imagine doing it.
How do you know here?
Oh,
Yes, earlier you said when you were doing the Second World War that 12% of the British Air Force was Polish. Now, for my family, who were all in the war, the number was 33%. So what was your source? I don't know what their source was.
that's a very good question. You can
Could
see
you
it.
repeat the question, Michael?
Sure. The question is that I cited that at the height, maybe it was the wording that I used, because I think I worded.
I remember 12%.
I know, but listen, I think the wording I used was at the height of the Battle of Britain. So that might have been explicitly June 1940 that they may have composed, especially the 303 Kosciuszko, was 12%. But you're right, certainly towards the end, it is probably in the 30% range, because something I would like to talk about on my next one would be the other squadrons, including a bomber squadron that was bombing Germany as well. So 33% Polish airmen is absolutely right over the course of the
So
war.
they didn't lie, all right.
Yep. Yeah, one? No?
I did.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I want to thank you for an exceptional presentation.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you. I do my best. Thank you for having me, and if you have any other questions, let me know. I'm sure everybody's hungry. Thank you.
It's on the edge of our seats.
Yeah, I have one other question. I'm glad you covered.
Everything I couldn't cover, there's still so much more. There's Polish very medal of honor winners that happen, you know?
I had the exceptional experience of going to the reinterment of Kazimir Pulaski. It was an incredible event. Every nation that he had served sent their latest naval ship, their military contingents, and their horses. It was
We need to
phenomenal.
hear, excuse me, we
Yeah.
need to hear, everybody needs to hear the questions. It can't be a private conversation, okay?
Well, I just wanted to point out the fact that Natasha and I had the pleasure of going to the reinterment of Kazimir Pulaski in Savannah. And it was an incredible event because every nation that he had fought for sent their #1 naval ship, their #1 military detachment, and their horses. It was quite a glorious day.
And every year in Savannah, they do something for that, so I can't wait to go to the next one in October. It's gonna be a busy October because that happens there. In Little Lake Harbor, they usually put on an event as well for Kashmir's battle that was there, which is only just being unearthed. The things that he did at Little Lake Harbor. When I was growing up, I thought Little Lake Harbor was called a massacre. I thought Muszynski was training some cavalry, they got ambushed, and he got embarrassed. None of that is true. It was just reported that by one source, and digging into all archival letters, Continental Congress, and they are all cited. The historical organization there in Little Lake Harbor uncovered a massive find down there. So Pulaski's contributions in Little Lake Harbor, among other places, very high.
Michael, here's another story. I'm glad you covered about General Pulaski Anders, okay? My father was an Armenian Christian in Iran. And one of our members, a long time ago, who escaped from Siberia, she was part of General Pulaski Anders' army in Tehran, Iran. My father was an Armenian Christian in Tehran, Iran. Nobody, when you go through the history books, nobody wants to report about all these Polish people in Iran under General Anders, okay?
Let alone the
But he
political.
saw a lot of Polish people joining General Anders, and when he was a 10-year-old kid, he told me that his school was next to the Russian embassy. He saw Joseph Stalin walk by him, he saw Churchill walk by him, and Roosevelt came in a Jeep up to the Russian embassy. When he saw Franklin Roosevelt get out, he said, why is he walking? They had to carry him up the stairs and have him, that famous, where he's sitting down. He said, my father said, he never realized that Franklin Roosevelt was a sick man physically and mentally, and he's got into the greatest nation in the world.
Yep. He had a year left to live that one.
Another thing they don't tell you about is that General Anders was friends with General Patton. He wanted to liberate all the rest of Eastern Europe, keep the Russians out.
Oh,
But they were prevented from doing that.
that's my favorite one.
You like?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna.
Or Dr.
Thank you, everyone.
We gotta buy our tickets to win our cruise.
you.